Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The secret begins. Have you ever smiled so naturally that everyone believed your life was perfect, while quietly carrying one truth that could change everything you loved? If you have ever wondered whether love can survive a secret that grows heavier with every passing year, stay with me until the end of this story. My name is Emma, and I live in a quiet American neighborhood where the streets are lined with maple trees, children ride their bicycles until sunset, and neighbors wave as if every day is peaceful. From the outside, my family looked exactly like the kind of family people admire. We laughed together, celebrated birthdays, took road trips every summer, and filled our home with photographs that captured happy moments. But every smile in those pictures was standing beside one secret. It was a secret my husband and I promised never to tell anyone. We believed we were protecting the people we loved. We believed silence was an act of kindness. We believed time would somehow solve everything. We were wrong. Looking back now, I realize that secrets do not disappear simply because you refuse to speak about them. They grow quietly, almost like a tree whose roots spread underground where nobody can see them. One day those roots become too strong to ignore. Before I tell you what happened, let me take you back to the beginning because every secret has a first moment, and every difficult choice starts with something that seems surprisingly ordinary. I have lived in the United States for many years, and one of the things I love most about this country is how different every season feels. Spring brings fresh flowers to our front yard. Summer fills neighborhood parks with laughter and family picnics. Autumn paints every street with bright orange and deep red leaves, while winter wraps everything in silence after the first snowfall. Those changing seasons often reminded me that life never stays the same, even when we desperately want it to. My husband used to say that every family carries a story that outsiders never see. At the time, I smiled because I thought he was simply being thoughtful. I did not realize those words would become the center of our lives. We met many wonderful people in our community. Some were teachers. Some worked in hospitals. Others owned small local businesses. Whenever we attended neighborhood gatherings, everyone described us as the calm couple who always seemed happy. They admired how respectfully we spoke to each other and how patiently we raised our children. Friends often asked us for marriage advice. That question always made me feel uncomfortable, although I never showed it. I would simply smile and say that every relationship grows through kindness, honest conversations, and small daily efforts. Those words were true, but they were not the whole truth. The whole truth stayed safely locked inside our home, hidden behind helping our children with homework or watching movies on quiet Friday nights. Sometimes I wondered whether carrying a secret actually changed the way we loved each other. According to relationship research published by psychologists studying long-term marriages, couples who regularly hide emotionally important information often experience higher levels of stress even when they believe the secret protects their relationship. That finding surprised me when I first read it because it perfectly described what I could never explain. We were not unhappy. We still loved each other deeply. My husband would glance at me for just a second. Nobody else noticed those tiny moments, but we always did. Over time, I learned that fear does not always arrive with loud arguments or dramatic events. Sometimes fear simply joins you at the dinner table and quietly waits beside your coffee every morning. It becomes part of your routine until you almost forget it is there. That was our life. Beautiful on the outside, complicated on the inside. Still, if you had visited our home, you probably would have seen nothing unusual. You would have heard laughter coming from the kitchen. You would have smelled fresh cookies baking in the oven during cold winter afternoons. You would have watched our children racing through the backyard while my husband pretended he could still outrun them. Everything looked wonderfully normal. Maybe that is exactly why our secret survived for so many years. Nobody suspects a happy family. Nobody imagines that the warmest smile in the room may be protecting the hardest story. And yet, everything began to change on one ordinary afternoon when a simple question from someone we trusted stopped time inside our living room. It was only one sentence. It sounded harmless. But the moment I heard those words, I realized the secret we had protected for years might finally come into the light. And I had no idea whether our love would survive what happened next. A chance meeting. The strange thing about life is that the biggest turning points rarely announce themselves. They often arrive disguised as ordinary mornings, ordinary conversations, or an ordinary smile from someone you have never seen before. The day I met my husband was exactly like that. It was a cool autumn morning in Illinois. The air smelled of fresh coffee and fallen leaves, and the sunlight slipped gently through rows of golden maple trees. I had planned nothing special. I simply wanted to buy groceries before heading home to prepare dinner. If someone had told me that one simple shopping trip would completely rewrite my future, I would have laughed and continued pushing my cart without another thought. But life has a quiet sense of humor. It changes everything when you are busy expecting nothing at all. At the local grocery store, I reached for the last loaf of fresh sourdough bread at exactly the same moment as another hand. We both stopped. We both smiled. "You can have it," he said with a warm laugh. His voice was calm, friendly, and carried the kind of confidence that immediately made people feel comfortable. I thanked him, but instead of taking the bread, I suggested we split the moment with another joke. "Only if you promise the bakery makes more tomorrow." He laughed again, and somehow that tiny conversation lasted much longer than either of us expected. His name was Daniel. He had lived in the town almost his entire life. He worked as a civil engineer and spent weekends helping his father repair old houses for elderly neighbors who could not afford expensive contractors. That detail stayed in my mind because kindness is often easier to trust than charming words. Many people know exactly what to say. Far fewer quietly choose to help when nobody is watching. During the following weeks, we kept meeting by coincidence. Sometimes at the farmer's market, sometimes at the public library. Once at a community volunteer event where families packed food boxes for local shelters. Eventually, Daniel smiled and admitted something that made me laugh for several minutes. "I don't think these meetings are completely accidental anymore." He was right. We had both started adjusting our schedules just enough to increase the chance of seeing each other again. Looking back now, it seems wonderfully innocent. Those early conversations were never dramatic. We talked about books, favorite American road trips, local restaurants, changing weather, and the little habits that make everyday life meaningful. We even laughed about how unpredictable Midwest weather could be. One week we enjoyed warm sunshine, and a few days later everyone searched for winter coats again. Those conversations slowly became the safest part of my day. Research from psychologists at Harvard has shown that long-term relationships are often built not on grand romantic gestures, but on thousands of small, positive interactions that create emotional safety over time. I did not know that research then, but I was living it without realizing. Every smile, every shared coffee, every quiet walk through the neighborhood park was building trust one simple conversation at a time. Because this channel is designed to help you practice English through real stories, let me share something that changed my confidence forever. Daniel never corrected my English in a way that embarrassed me. Instead, whenever I searched for a word, he waited patiently. If I made a small grammar mistake, he naturally repeated the sentence correctly during his own reply instead of pointing out my error. That gentle approach lowered my anxiety immediately. Modern language learning research consistently shows that learners improve faster when they feel emotionally safe rather than afraid of making mistakes. That became true for me. Little by little, I stopped translating every sentence inside my head. I simply spoke. Some days my English sounded smooth. Other days it sounded awkward. Daniel never seemed to care. He always cared more about what I meant than whether every verb was perfect. That simple attitude taught me something far bigger than grammar. Real communication begins with courage, not perfection. As the months passed, we discovered that despite our different backgrounds, our values were surprisingly similar. We both believed family dinners mattered. We both enjoyed simple weekends more than expensive vacations. We both believed that trust should be earned through actions instead of promises. Friends often joked that we looked comfortable together long before we officially became a couple. Maybe they were right. Comfort is a quiet kind of love. It grows slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize someone has become part of your daily happiness. On one snowy December evening, Daniel invited me to a small Christmas festival in the town square. Lights covered every tree, children laughed while drinking hot chocolate, and local musicians played familiar holiday songs that floated through the cold night air. Everything felt peaceful. As snowflakes landed softly on my coat, Daniel looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was hopeful, but also nervous. He reached into his pocket, not to pull out a ring, but something much simpler. It was an old photograph of his family taken many years earlier. "There is something important about my family that I want you to know someday," he said quietly. "Not tonight. But before we build a future together, you deserve the whole truth." At that moment, I smiled because I believed every love story eventually reached an honest conversation. I had no idea those words were opening the door to the very secret that would one day test everything we believed about love, trust, marriage, and the future we were only beginning to dream about. The promise we made. There is a quiet moment in every relationship when love stops feeling like excitement and starts becoming a choice. It is the moment when two people realize that the future will ask difficult questions, and neither of them knows all the answers. Looking back, I believe that was the night our real story began. After Daniel showed me the old family photograph at the Christmas festival, I noticed something different about him. He was still kind, still thoughtful, still the man who made me laugh over simple dinners and long walks through our neighborhood. But behind every smile, I could see a question he was afraid to ask. A few days later, he invited me to a small lakeside park just outside town. Winter had covered everything with a thin blanket of snow, and the frozen water reflected the pale afternoon sky. The park was almost empty except for a few children throwing snowballs in the distance. Daniel stood quietly for a moment before speaking. "I don't want to build a relationship that depends on pretending," he said softly. "But I also don't want to hurt the people I love." His words stayed with me because they sounded painfully honest. He explained that years earlier, someone close to his family had made a decision that changed many lives. It was not a crime. It was not a betrayal. But it was a deeply personal truth that had been hidden to protect someone who had already suffered enough. Only a few family members knew the complete story. Everyone else believed a different version. "If people discover it the wrong way," he whispered, "they may judge someone who never deserved to be judged." I listened without interrupting. Sometimes people do not need immediate advice. They simply need someone willing to stay beside them while they carry a heavy memory. That afternoon taught me one of the most important lessons about love. Compassion often begins long before understanding does. I did not know every detail, yet I could already feel how much emotional weight Daniel had been carrying for years. According to psychologists who study emotional trust, Sharing vulnerable information activates the same parts of the brain associated with physical safety and human connection. When someone risks telling you something deeply personal, they are offering more than information. They are placing part of their emotional life into your hands. I felt the seriousness of that moment without needing scientific research to explain it. We spent hours talking beside the frozen lake. The cold air turned our breath into tiny clouds, but neither of us wanted to leave. We spoke about family, forgiveness, fear, and the strange pressure people feel to appear perfect. Social media often shows beautiful homes, smiling couples, and happy children. Yet almost every family quietly carries struggles that never appear in photographs. Ours would eventually become one of them. Before the sun disappeared behind the trees, Daniel looked at me and asked a question I never expected. If we build a life together, could you help me protect this secret until the right time? He did not demand an answer. He simply waited. I remember watching snowflakes fall onto my gloves while thinking about everything we had shared over the previous months. I trusted his kindness. I trusted his honesty. Most importantly, I trusted the way he treated people when nobody was watching. Finally, I nodded. Yes, I said quietly. But only if one day we promised to tell the truth, when keeping silent would hurt more than speaking. Daniel smiled with visible relief. It was the first time in weeks that the worry disappeared from his face. We shook hands first, almost laughing at how formal we looked, and then he gently held my hand as we walked back toward the parking lot. Neither of us realized that our simple promise would shape every major decision we made for years to come. A few months later, Daniel asked me to marry him. There were no expensive fireworks, no dramatic crowd, and no luxury vacation. He proposed during a spring picnic in a quiet public park where cherry blossoms floated through the warm afternoon breeze. Children were flying colorful kites nearby, dogs chased tennis balls across the grass, and somewhere in the distance a musician played an old guitar. The ordinary beauty of that afternoon made everything feel genuine. When I said yes, I believed our greatest challenge would be learning how to build a happy marriage together. I imagined discussions about finances, raising children, balancing careers, and deciding where to spend holidays. Those challenges eventually came, just like they do for every couple. But hidden quietly beneath all those ordinary moments was the promise we had made beside the frozen lake. At first, it seemed manageable. Weeks became months. Months became years. The secret stayed safely hidden, and life rewarded us with beautiful memories. We bought our first home. We planted flowers in the front yard. We welcomed our first child into the world. Friends congratulated us for creating what looked like the perfect American family. Every compliment filled me with gratitude, but it also reminded me of the silent promise resting between us. Sometimes late at night, after the children had fallen asleep, Daniel and I would sit together on our back porch without saying much at all. We did not need long conversations. One look was enough to remind us that the truth was still waiting patiently for its own moment. Neither of us knew that life was already preparing that moment, and when it finally arrived, our promise would become the greatest test our marriage had ever faced. Living with silence. Silence has a strange personality. At first, it feels gentle, almost comforting, like a warm blanket protecting you from the cold. But if you wrap yourself in it for too long, it slowly becomes heavier than you ever imagined. That was exactly what happened to us. During the first years of our marriage, our secret seemed easy to carry. Life moved quickly, giving us countless beautiful distractions. We welcomed our first daughter into the world on a bright spring morning, and suddenly every sleepless night, every tiny laugh, and every first step became more important than anything else. Later, our son was born, filling our home with even more energy, noise, and unforgettable memories. From the outside, our life looked like the American dream so many people imagine. We owned a modest house with a white porch, planted flowers every spring, carved pumpkins every October, decorated our home with Christmas lights every December, and spent summer weekends driving to nearby lakes for family picnics. If you had walked past our house on a Saturday afternoon, you probably would have seen Daniel grilling hamburgers while the children chased Bubbles across the backyard. You would have heard music playing softly from the kitchen window and neighbors laughing over the fence. Nothing about our family suggested that we were protecting a life-changing secret. That was the dangerous part. The happier life became, the more impossible it felt to disturb it. Every year we told ourselves the same comforting sentence. Maybe next year will be the right time. Then another year quietly disappeared. Researchers who study decision-making describe this as the delay effect. When people postpone emotionally difficult conversations, the temporary relief tricks the brain into believing waiting is the safest choice. Unfortunately, the emotional cost usually grows with time instead of shrinking. I did not know the scientific name then, but I understood the feeling perfectly. Every postponed conversation made the next one feel even harder. Sometimes I caught myself imagining impossible situations. What if someone accidentally discovered the truth? What if our children heard it from another person before hearing it from us? What if silence, which had once protected everyone, eventually caused the very pain we wanted to avoid? Those questions quietly followed me everywhere. They sat beside me while I folded laundry, prepared school lunches, or waited in the car outside soccer practice. Fear never shouted. It whispered. One evening our daughter came home from elementary school carrying a family history project. She happily spread colorful papers across the dining table and asked innocent questions about grandparents, old photographs, birthdays, and important family memories. Daniel and I exchanged a quick glance that lasted less than 2 seconds. Our daughter never noticed, but we both felt the same uncomfortable pressure. We answered every question honestly except for the one answer connected to the secret we had promised to protect. That tiny omission stayed with me long after she finished her homework. It was the first time I realized that silence is rarely made of one big decision. More often, it is built from hundreds of tiny moments that seem harmless on their own. Despite those private struggles, our marriage remained loving. Daniel never stopped making coffee for me every morning before work. I never stopped leaving little handwritten notes inside his lunch bag. Every Friday night became family movie night, complete with homemade popcorn and blankets covering the living room floor. Those routines may sound ordinary, but psychologists say predictable acts of kindness strengthen emotional security more than expensive gifts. Looking back, those small habits became the quiet foundation that kept our relationship standing while the hidden truth continued growing beneath it. Because this story is also meant to help you practice English naturally, I want to share one expression that became meaningful in our lives. Actions speak louder than words. At first, I thought it was simply a common English idiom. Later I realized it perfectly described marriage itself. Love is rarely measured by dramatic speeches. It is measured by everyday actions repeated consistently over many years. Daniel proved his love every single day. The problem was never a lack of love. The problem was the growing distance between the truth we lived and the story everyone else believed. Then something unexpected happened that changed the atmosphere inside our home. Daniel's mother called one Sunday afternoon and invited the entire family to a large reunion planned for the following summer. Relatives from several states would travel across the country to attend. Cousins we had not seen for years would finally gather together. Everyone sounded excited. Everyone except Daniel. The moment he ended the phone call, I noticed the color leave his face. He sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at nothing for several long seconds. Finally, he whispered words that immediately filled the room with tension. If everyone comes together this year, there's a chance someone will ask the one question we've been hoping nobody would ever ask. My heart began beating faster because I knew exactly what he meant. For years, coincidence had protected us. Distance had protected us. Timing had protected us. But now dozens of family members would soon be sitting in the same room, sharing memories, comparing old photographs, and telling stories from the past. One unexpected conversation could connect pieces that had remained separated for decades. As I looked out the kitchen window, our children were laughing together in the backyard without a single worry in the world. I wanted to believe everything would be fine. I wanted to believe we could survive one more family gathering without anyone discovering the truth. Deep inside, however, I felt something I had never experienced before. For the first time in many years, silence no longer felt like protection. It felt like a countdown that had already begun. Cracks behind smiles. It is amazing how a single invitation can change the atmosphere inside an entire house. The family reunion was still months away, yet it already felt as if an invisible clock had started ticking above our heads. Every passing week reminded Daniel and me that we were running out of time. The strange part was that nothing looked different from the outside. Our children still rushed downstairs every morning asking what was for breakfast. Daniel still kissed me goodbye before leaving for work. I still watered the flowers on our front porch every evening while neighbors stopped to chat about the weather, school events, or the next community barbecue. Life continued exactly as it always had, but inside our hearts, something had quietly shifted. The secret was no longer resting peacefully in the background. It had stepped into the center of our marriage without saying a word. I began noticing changes that were almost impossible to explain. Daniel became quieter during family conversations. Whenever someone mentioned childhood memories or distant relatives, his smile appeared a second too late. At night, he sometimes stayed awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep. Sitting alone on the back porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, I often joined him without speaking. Some silences between two people feel lonely. Ours felt different. They were filled with thousands of unspoken thoughts that neither of us wanted to say out loud. Research from the American Psychological Association suggests that prolonged emotional suppression increases stress hormones and reduces relationship satisfaction over time, even among couples who deeply love one another. Reading that article one evening felt almost unsettling because it described our lives with surprising accuracy. We were not arguing more. We were not falling out of love. We were simply becoming exhausted from protecting something that demanded constant emotional energy. Then came a moment that neither of us expected. One Saturday afternoon, our daughter, now old enough to enjoy looking through family photo albums, climbed into the attic searching for decorations for a school project. A few minutes later, she called my name with innocent excitement.
Mom.
I found a box full of old pictures. My heart skipped a beat before I even climbed the stairs. Daniel looked at me from across the hallway, and without exchanging a single word, we both hurried upward. Fortunately, she had only opened one small box filled with holiday photographs. The other box, the one containing the picture Daniel had shown me years earlier beside the frozen lake, remained closed behind several old blankets. I smiled, trying to hide my relief, while helping her choose pictures for her assignment. She noticed nothing unusual. Children rarely do. But after she left the attic, Daniel closed the storage box slowly and whispered, "We're getting too close." That evening we had our first serious disagreement in years. It was not loud. Nobody shouted. In many ways, that made it even more painful. Maybe we should tell them before someone else does, I said carefully. Daniel looked down at the kitchen table before answering. And if telling the truth hurts someone who has already suffered enough? I understood his fear, because I shared it. Yet another question had started growing inside me. What if hiding the truth hurt everyone even more? Neither of us had a perfect answer. We simply sat together in silence while the sound of rain tapped softly against the windows. Sometimes marriage is not about choosing between right and wrong. Sometimes it is about choosing between two painful possibilities and hoping love will survive whichever path you take. During those difficult weeks, I discovered something unexpected through my English practice. Every morning while driving to work, I listened to slow English stories and repeated simple sentences aloud. One phrase stayed with me more than any other. The truth may be difficult, but uncertainty is often harder. I repeated those words again and again until they no longer felt like language practice. They became a quiet message to myself. Perhaps that is why learning a language through stories can be so powerful. Sometimes the vocabulary improves your English. Other times, the story quietly changes the way you think about your own life. Modern neuroscience supports this idea. Studies have shown that stories activate multiple regions of the brain, making emotional lessons easier to remember than isolated facts or grammar rules. Without realizing it, I was becoming braver one sentence at a time. Then the unexpected happened. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel received a phone call from his older cousin, Michael, who was helping organize the upcoming reunion. The conversation sounded ordinary until I heard one sentence that made my stomach tighten. Grandma found some old documents while cleaning the basement, Michael said over the speakerphone. She wants everyone to look through them together at the reunion. There are letters, family records, and photographs nobody has seen in decades. It's going to be amazing. Daniel thanked him, ended the call, and remained perfectly still. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. We both knew exactly what those forgotten boxes might contain. Memories have a strange way of surviving longer than secrets. A single photograph, an old letter, or one overlooked document could connect every missing piece in an instant. That night, after the children were asleep, Daniel finally looked at me with tired eyes and said the words I had secretly expected for weeks. I think we're about to lose the choice of when the truth comes out. I reached for his hand across the table. Outside, the summer wind moved gently through the trees, but inside our home, everything felt different. The countdown was no longer measured in months. It had become measured in days, and somewhere waiting beyond that family reunion was a conversation capable of changing our marriage forever. The day everything changed. Some days begin so normally that you never imagine they will divide your life into two chapters. Everything before and everything after. The morning of the family reunion felt exactly like that. The sun was already shining through our bedroom window when I woke up, and for a brief moment, I almost forgot why my heart felt so heavy. Then I saw the neatly packed suitcases beside the door, and reality returned all at once.
Today was the day.
The day we had quietly feared for years. The day our carefully protected secret could finally step out of the shadows. Daniel smiled as he poured coffee into 2 travel mugs, but I recognized the expression immediately. It was the same smile he wore whenever he was trying to protect me from his own worries. We loaded the children into the car, started the long drive across the state, and watched miles of American highways stretch endlessly ahead. Our daughter laughed while counting red pickup trucks. Our son played guessing games about which songs would come on the radio next. Their laughter filled the car, making it almost impossible to believe that 2 adults sitting in the front seats were carrying a truth capable of changing an entire family. Sometimes children unknowingly become the greatest reminder of what is worth protecting. During the drive, Daniel quietly reached for my hand without taking his eyes off the road. He squeezed it gently, saying nothing at all. That silent gesture spoke louder than any speech could have. According to relationship researchers at the University of Virginia, simple physical reassurance during stressful situations lowers emotional distress and strengthens feelings of partnership. I smiled when I remembered reading about that study months earlier. It explained why one small touch could calm a storm that words could never reach. By the time we arrived, the reunion was already full of life. Cars filled the long gravel driveway. Children ran across the wide green lawn chasing each other with water balloons. The smell of grilled burgers, fresh corn, and homemade apple pie drifted through the warm summer air. Laughter echoed from every corner of the backyard as relatives greeted one another after years apart. It looked like the perfect American family gathering. Daniel's grandmother sat proudly on the porch, surrounded by grandchildren, telling stories that everyone had heard many times before, but still enjoyed listening to. Looking around, I almost convinced myself that perhaps everything would be fine after all. Maybe the documents Michael mentioned were nothing important. Maybe our fears had grown larger than reality itself. Hope has a remarkable way of appearing when we need it most. Then Grandma stood up slowly and smiled. Before dinner, she announced happily, "I found something special that belongs to all of us." My heartbeat immediately accelerated. She disappeared into the house and returned carrying 2 dusty cardboard boxes tied with faded blue ribbon. Time seemed to slow down. I watched Daniel swallow nervously beside me. Nobody else noticed. Everyone simply gathered closer with curiosity and excitement. Old letters, black and white photographs, newspaper clippings, birth certificates, handwritten notes, and family keepsakes were carefully placed across the large dining table on the back patio. Relatives laughed as they recognized younger versions of parents and grandparents. Every few minutes, someone would hold up another picture and ask, "Does anyone remember this?" The atmosphere remained joyful, until it didn't. Michael reached into the second box and pulled out a thick envelope that looked untouched for decades. "What's this?" he asked. Grandma adjusted her glasses before answering. "I don't remember opening that one." My breathing became shallow. Daniel's eyes met mine for only a fraction of a second, but I understood exactly what he was thinking. Michael carefully unfolded several yellowed papers before suddenly stopping. The smile disappeared from his face. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured quietly. Several relatives leaned closer. "What is it?" someone asked. Michael looked confused. "These dates. These names." The conversation around the table slowly faded into complete silence. Every person instinctively sensed that something important had just appeared. I felt as though the entire world had stopped moving. My hands became cold despite the summer heat. For years we had imagined this exact moment in dozens of different ways. Yet none of those imaginary versions prepared me for how terrifying reality would feel. Daniel stood motionless beside me. I could almost hear his breathing. Then Grandma looked directly at him. "Daniel," she said gently, "I think you know what these papers are about."
No accusation. No anger.
Just quiet curiosity. The silence that followed seemed endless. Every face turned toward us. Children stopped playing nearby, sensing the unusual mood without understanding why. For the first time in our marriage, the secret was no longer hiding behind closed doors. It was standing in the middle of the family, waiting for someone to speak first. I looked at Daniel, expecting fear, but instead I saw something completely different. Relief. Years of emotional weight seemed to disappear from his eyes in a single moment. He slowly reached for my hand, just as he had during the drive, and whispered so softly that only I could hear, "We can't run anymore." My heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. Every promise we had made beside that frozen lake years earlier had led us to this exact second. There would be no more delaying. No more protecting the truth with silence. Whatever happened next would change our family forever, and with every pair of eyes waiting for an answer, Daniel took one slow step forward, opened his mouth, and prepared to tell the story we had hidden for so many years. Telling the truth. There is a strange kind of freedom that arrives just seconds before you stop hiding. It feels terrifying, almost impossible. Yet somewhere beneath the fear there is a quiet sense that your heart is finally about to breathe again. As every member of Daniel's family stood around the old wooden table, waiting for an explanation, I realized there would never be a more honest moment than this one. Daniel looked at the faded documents one last time before raising his eyes toward his grandmother. His voice was calm, but I could hear years of emotion behind every word. "Grandma," he began softly, "those papers tell a story our family tried to protect, not because anyone was ashamed, but because we believed silence was the kindest choice." Nobody interrupted him. Even the children playing nearby seemed unusually quiet, as if the entire afternoon had paused to listen. Daniel carefully picked up one of the yellowed letters. "Many years ago," he continued, "someone in our family made an incredibly difficult decision to protect a child who deserved a peaceful future. A different story was shared with relatives because everyone believed that truth would only create unnecessary pain." I watched confusion spread across several faces. Some people exchanged uncertain glances. Others leaned closer, trying to understand what they had never been told. Daniel took a slow breath before saying the words we had rehearsed so many times in private, but never imagined speaking aloud. The secret was never about deception for personal gain. It was about love. It was about protecting someone whose life had already begun with enough hardship. Grandma closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears, not tears of anger, but of memory. She quietly nodded before whispering, "I always wondered if this day would finally come." Those words surprised everyone, including Daniel. For years he had believed only a handful of people truly understood the entire story. But Grandma had known much more than anyone realized. She slowly reached for his hand. "Your grandfather and I made that decision together," she admitted. A wave of astonishment moved across the family. The silence that followed felt completely different from the silence we had carried for years. This silence was no longer built on fear. It was built on people trying to absorb a truth that had quietly shaped generations. One cousin finally asked the question everyone seemed afraid to speak. "Why didn't anyone tell us?" Grandma smiled sadly. "Because sometimes adults convince themselves that protecting hearts means hiding facts. We forget that love and truth were never supposed to be enemies." Her answer settled gently into every corner of the backyard. Nobody argued. Nobody shouted. There were tears, certainly. There was confusion. There were long pauses. But there was something else too, compassion. Modern psychology offers an interesting explanation for moments like this. Researchers studying family communication have found that when vulnerable truths are shared with sincerity instead of defensiveness, listeners are significantly more likely to respond with empathy rather than judgment. I watched that principle come alive right in front of me. Instead of asking, "Who is to blame?" relatives began asking, "How did you carry this alone for so many years?" The difference was extraordinary. Daniel answered every question honestly. He admitted that keeping the secret had often felt exhausting. He admitted there were nights he barely slept because he worried someone would accidentally discover everything. I spoke too, explaining that our promise had never been about hiding from our family. It had been about honoring a decision made years before we entered the picture. But somewhere along the way, I confessed, protecting the secret became heavier than protecting each other. Several family members quietly wiped away tears. Then something happened that none of us expected. Daniel's mother stood up, walked across the patio, and hugged her son without saying a single word. One by one, other relatives followed.
No dramatic speeches. No accusations.
Just embraces that seemed to erase years of invisible distance. Our children watched the scene with curious expressions. Our daughter finally whispered, "Mom, is everyone okay?" I smiled, kneeling beside her. "Yes," I answered gently. "Everyone is finally telling the truth." She looked around at the adults hugging each other and smiled back, apparently satisfied with that simple explanation. Sometimes children understand emotional healing much faster than adults do. As dinner finally began, the atmosphere slowly became lighter. Conversations shifted from secrecy to shared memories. Old photographs that once felt dangerous now became opportunities to tell complete stories instead of edited ones. For the first time in years, I noticed Daniel laughing without the tiny hesitation that had quietly followed him through every family gathering. The invisible weight resting on his shoulders had disappeared. Watching him laugh so freely almost brought me to tears because I realized something important. We had spent years fearing rejection, yet the thing our family needed most had never been perfect appearances. They simply needed honesty. As the evening sun slowly disappeared behind the trees, casting golden light across the backyard, Grandma asked everyone to gather for one large family photograph. We stood together smiling while someone counted down from 3. This time, however, something was completely different. There was no hidden story standing beside our smiles anymore. The secret that had once defined our marriage had finally become the truth that united our family. I truly believed the hardest part of our journey was finally over. But later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Daniel received an unexpected phone call that would prove telling the truth was only the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Rebuilding trust. Most people believe that the hardest part of telling the truth is the moment the secret is revealed. I used to think the same thing. But I was wrong. The confession lasted only a few minutes. Rebuilding life afterward would take much longer. Late that evening, after the family reunion had finally become quiet and everyone had gone to bed, Daniel's phone rang. The name on the screen belonged to his uncle, the one relative who had left the gathering early without saying goodbye. Daniel stepped outside onto the porch to answer, and through the open window, I could hear only fragments of the conversation. There was no shouting.
No anger.
Just long pauses that somehow sounded even heavier. When he came back inside, he sat beside me without speaking. His eyes looked tired, but not defeated. "He isn't angry," Daniel finally said. "He's hurt that he learned the truth so late." I nodded slowly. That reaction made perfect sense. Honesty can heal, but it cannot erase the years that came before it. The following weeks became some of the most emotionally complicated days of our marriage. Several relatives called simply to talk. Some wanted to understand details they had never known. Others shared memories that suddenly made more sense after hearing the complete story. A few admitted they wished the truth had been shared years earlier. Surprisingly, nobody accused us of acting out of selfishness. Instead, almost everyone asked the same question in different words. "How did you carry something this heavy for so long?" I never knew how to answer. Perhaps because the burden had become so familiar that I no longer noticed its weight until it disappeared. Psychologists often describe emotional adaptation as the tendency to normalize ongoing stress. People gradually become accustomed to carrying invisible pressure until they forget what peace actually feels like. That explanation stayed with me because it perfectly described our lives. We had adapted to fear so completely that calmness felt unfamiliar. One Saturday morning, about a month after the reunion, Daniel suggested we drive to the same frozen lake where we had made our promise years earlier.
It was summer now.
The snow was gone. Green trees surrounded the water, children fed ducks from the wooden dock, and gentle waves reflected the bright afternoon sky. Standing there again felt almost unreal. "Do you remember what we promised here?" Daniel asked quietly. I smiled. "Yes," I answered. "We promised to protect the secret until silence caused more harm than truth." He looked across the peaceful lake before replying. "I think we kept both parts of that promise." His words stayed with me for the rest of the day. Sometimes we judge our past decisions using information we only gained afterward. But real life rarely works that way. We make choices with the knowledge we have at the time, hoping love will guide us better than fear. Looking back with kindness became an important part of our healing. Around that same time, something beautiful began happening inside our home. The children noticed subtle changes, without fully understanding why. Daniel laughed more often. I stopped checking my phone every time a family member called. Dinner conversations became lighter. Even our dog seemed happier now that everyone smiled more. Stress has a remarkable way of affecting an entire household, even when nobody speaks about it directly. Studies from family psychology researchers suggest that children often sense emotional tension long before adults realize they are showing it. That realization made me grateful we had chosen honesty before our children grew older. One evening our daughter asked a question that completely surprised me. "Mom," she said while helping me bake chocolate chip cookies, "why does Dad seem happier lately?" I paused for a second before answering. "Because sometimes grown-ups carry worries for a long time," I explained. "When they finally solve them, their hearts become lighter." She thought about that for a moment before smiling. "I hope my heart always stays light." I hugged her tightly, silently promising myself to do everything possible to make that happen. Because this channel helps people improve English through meaningful stories, let me share another simple sentence that became unforgettable for me. Trust grows in drops but falls in buckets. At first, I only liked how the sentence sounded. Later, I understood its wisdom. Trust is built slowly, through countless small actions, honest conversations, and consistent kindness. Fortunately, the opposite can also be true. Once honesty returns, every sincere action becomes another small drop, rebuilding what fear once weakened. Daniel and I started creating new traditions together. Every Sunday morning we walked through a nearby farmer's market before eating breakfast at a small family-owned cafe. Every month we planned one screen-free evening where the whole family played board games, talked, or simply watched the sunset from our backyard. These routines may sound simple, but research consistently shows that shared positive experiences strengthen emotional resilience in families far more effectively than occasional grand gestures. Life slowly began feeling wonderfully ordinary again. Yet one final conversation still waited for us. Several weeks after the reunion, Grandma invited Daniel and me to visit her alone. She wanted to give us something she had quietly kept hidden for decades. As she placed a small wooden box on the living room table, her gentle smile told me this gift would not only explain the past, it would completely change the way we understood our family's future. What the secret taught us. Some gifts are wrapped in beautiful paper. Others arrive inside old wooden boxes that have quietly waited for decades to be opened. When Daniel and I visited Grandma the following weekend, she welcomed us with her usual warm smile, homemade cinnamon bread, and fresh coffee. Nothing about the afternoon felt dramatic. The windows were open, a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the living room, and an old clock ticked steadily on the wall. Yet the small wooden box resting on the table seemed to hold years of unanswered questions. Grandma slowly pushed it toward us. "I've been waiting for the right time," she said softly. "Now I think your family is finally ready." Daniel carefully lifted the lid. Inside were handwritten letters, several faded photographs, and a leather-bound journal that belonged to his grandfather. The pages had turned yellow with age, but the handwriting remained clear. Daniel opened the journal at random and began reading silently. After only a few lines, tears filled his eyes. He handed the journal to me without saying a word. The first sentence caught my attention immediately. "The hardest choice in life is not deciding whether to tell the truth. It is deciding when the truth will help instead of harm." I read those words again and again. Suddenly, years of confusion began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. His grandparents had never intended the secret to last forever. They had simply hoped that one day the family would be strong enough to understand it with compassion instead of judgment. Somewhere along the way, however, fear quietly replaced wisdom. Every generation inherited not only the secret itself, but also the anxiety of deciding when to reveal it. We had unknowingly become the final guardians of a burden that was never supposed to last this long. Grandma watched us quietly before speaking again. "Your grandfather always believed someone would eventually have the courage to end the silence," she whispered. "I'm proud that it was you." Those words stayed in my heart long after we drove home. For years I had questioned whether we had made the right decisions. Hearing Grandma say that did not erase every regret, but it gave me something even more valuable: peace. Researchers studying emotional resilience often explain that healing begins when people create a meaningful narrative around painful experiences. Instead of seeing them as random suffering, that idea perfectly described what happened to us. Our secret stopped being a source of shame and became a story about love, protection, difficult choices, and finally, courage. The experience changed the way I viewed everyday life as well. I became more patient when people reacted emotionally. I stopped assuming that smiling faces always represented easy lives. Every person you meet may be carrying an invisible story that you know nothing about. That realization made me kinder in ways I had never expected. At work, I listened more carefully before offering advice. When neighbors seemed unusually quiet, I asked how they were doing instead of assuming everything was fine. Compassion became less of an idea and more of a daily habit. Interestingly, psychological research supports this transformation. Studies have found that people who successfully process difficult life experiences often develop greater empathy and stronger relationships afterward. Pain, when faced honestly, can become one of life's greatest teachers. Around that same time, my English learning also changed in an unexpected way. Before, I practiced because I wanted to speak more fluently. Now I practiced because I wanted to connect more deeply with people. Every new word became another opportunity to understand someone else's story. Every listening exercise reminded me that real communication begins with paying attention, not with speaking perfectly. One phrase became my favorite: "Every person is fighting a battle you cannot see." It is a simple sentence, but it carries extraordinary wisdom. Whenever I repeated it during my English practice, I remembered our own journey and smiled. One evening, our daughter asked if we could create a new family tradition. Instead of talking about the best part of our day, she suggested, "Can we also talk about something difficult that happened?" Daniel and I looked at each other and smiled. Without realizing it, she had created exactly the kind of family culture we wished had existed years earlier. Every night after dinner, each of us shared one joyful moment and one challenge from the day. Some conversations were funny, others were emotional. But one thing became beautifully clear. Nobody had to carry heavy feelings alone anymore. Months passed, and life continued moving forward with a quiet sense of freedom we had almost forgotten was possible. Then, on the anniversary of the family reunion, we gathered again at Grandma's house. This time there were no hidden envelopes, no uncomfortable silences, and no questions left unanswered. Instead, everyone laughed freely while looking through the same old photographs that had once terrified us. It amazed me how differently memories could feel once fear disappeared. As the evening came to an end, Grandma gently placed her hand on mine and smiled. "You've closed one chapter," she said. "Now it's time to write a new one." Driving home beneath a sky filled with stars, I realized she was right. The secret had shaped our past, but it no longer controlled our future. And although our story finally felt complete, there was still one last lesson waiting to reveal itself, a lesson that would forever change the meaning of love, family, and truth for every generation that came after us. Love chose the truth. If someone had asked me years ago whether love could survive one enormous secret, I probably would have answered with uncertainty. Today, after everything our family has experienced, my answer is very different. Love does not survive because secrets remain hidden. Love survives because sooner or later, someone chooses courage over fear. That choice changed our family forever. 1 year after the reunion, life looked surprisingly ordinary again, but this time ordinary felt extraordinary. Every morning Daniel and I still made coffee together before the children woke up. We still argued playfully about who forgot to buy milk or whose turn it was to take out the trash. We still spent weekends cheering at soccer games, walking through local farmers markets, and watching colorful sunsets from our backyard. The difference was invisible to everyone else, yet impossible for us to ignore. Our home no longer contained a room filled with silence. Every conversation, every laugh, and every family photograph now carried a sense of peace that had been missing for years. Researchers who study long-term happiness often explain that emotional well-being is not created by perfect circumstances. It grows when our actions, values, and relationships become aligned. Looking around our kitchen one ordinary Tuesday evening, I finally understood exactly what that meant. We were no longer pretending that our lives had always been simple. We had accepted that difficult chapters belong to every family, and somehow that acceptance made joy feel even more genuine. A few months later, our daughter came home from school with another family history assignment. This time, she asked if she could interview Grandma about the past. Daniel looked at me, smiling softly, and I smiled back. There was no nervous glance.
No hesitation.
No hidden box waiting in the attic. Grandma happily shared stories, photographs, and memories without skipping a single chapter. Later that evening, our daughter proudly announced, "Our family isn't perfect, but I think that's what makes it interesting." We all laughed because she had accidentally discovered one of life's greatest truths before becoming a teenager. Perfection may impress people for a moment, but authenticity is what truly connects hearts. Because this channel is also about learning English through meaningful stories, I want to leave you with one expression that became part of my everyday life. The truth sets you free. At first, I believed that sentence meant life would become easy after honesty. It doesn't. Some conversations remain uncomfortable. Some consequences cannot be avoided. But truth offers something even more valuable than comfort. It gives you the freedom to stop pretending. That freedom is difficult to describe until you experience it yourself. Psychological studies consistently show that authentic relationships create stronger emotional resilience, lower long-term stress, and improve overall life satisfaction. Looking back, I realize our greatest victory was never protecting the secret. Our greatest victory was finding the courage to stop carrying it alone. Today, when neighbors walk past our house and wave from across the street, they still see the same family they have always known. Daniel still grills hamburgers every summer. Our children still race through the backyard chasing each other until sunset. Christmas lights still cover our porch every December, and pumpkins still decorate the front steps every October. On the surface, almost nothing has changed, yet everything has changed. The laughter is lighter. The hugs last longer. Conversations are more honest. Even silence feels different now because it is peaceful rather than fearful. Sometimes I receive messages from people who watch videos like this while learning English. Many tell me they feel discouraged because they speak slowly, make grammar mistakes, or forget simple words during conversations. If that sounds familiar, I hope you remember something from our story. Progress is rarely dramatic. A strong marriage is built one honest conversation at a time. A confidence in English grows one simple sentence at a time. Trust returns one kind action at a time. Small steps may seem insignificant today, but over months and years they quietly transform your entire life. Never underestimate what consistent effort can accomplish. Every page of our story was written through small decisions that seemed ordinary when they happened. Looking back, those ordinary choices became extraordinary turning points. One day your children will read it, and they'll understand that every family has difficult chapters. It no longer represents a secret. It represents courage. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I open it and read the very first sentence again. The hardest choice in life is not deciding whether to tell the truth. It is deciding when the truth will help instead of harm. Every time I read those words, I remember how far we've come. I remember the fear, the silence, the tears, the forgiveness, and finally the peace. Most importantly, I remember that love was never destroyed by the truth.
It was strengthened by it.
And if our journey has taught me anything, it is this. The strongest families are not the ones with perfect histories. They are the ones brave enough to face imperfect truths together, forgive generously, and keep choosing each other every single day. Perhaps that is the real secret we were searching for all along.
That's all for today.
I'll be creating many more stories like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.